Before we get into it, just a note. This episode includes content that could be upsetting. We'll be talking about depression and self-harm.
I have settled down to my fifth incarnation. Under the sunny skies of La Jolla, I swim and loaf, and for the first time in my life, I have relaxed and stopped chasing rainbows.
I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science, where we unearth stories of scientists who haven't gotten the recognition they deserved. That line you heard about chasing rainbows comes from a chapter in Clara Don van Neumann's memoir. In this, our last episode of the season, we explore that newest incarnation of Klári's life, her final years in sunny California that were filled with the promise of peace and quiet. We left off last episode in 1957. Klári's husband, John van Neumann, had died at the age of 53 after an agonizing year and a half with cancer. Many of his colleagues in Princeton and Los Alamos were shaken by the loss.
Even when there are differences, they feel it really deeply when one of their own passes. So I think what we see in the record is an outpouring of the community feeling sorry and expressing their concern for Clara.
That's Caitlin Rizzo, the archivist at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. After Johnny died, Klári received many letters from the important people in her life. In one, her mother, Camilla, wrote, "You had a lot of stress and sorrow. You've had enough of it for the next 100 years." Klári was heartbroken. She was also exhausted, because on top of her grief, she had to deal with everything Johnny left behind.
The administrative aftermath of what happens to publications and how do we handle his papers, what can we do for you to ease this?
After Johnny died, I set myself the task of collecting his published and unpublished papers and getting them together in one set of volumes.
That's Ava Szabo reading from Klári's unpublished memoir again. And though the work may have had the unintended benefit of keeping Johnny close to her, it consumed much of her time.
It was an overwhelming job, particularly since he was very prolific and in so many different fields.
Klári couldn't do this all by herself. She needed help. And somewhere along the line, in search of said help, she called Carl Eckert. Carl was a physicist whom Johnny had really respected as one of the most knowledgeable people in the scientific community. In 1957, Carl was working as a geophysicist at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in La Jolla. Klári asked Carl to edit a volume of John von Neumann's collected works. They spent a little time together on the phone, and then a little more time on the East Coast, and in the end,
although he never took on the job, we did get married.
So while Carl said no to editing the collected works of Klári's late husband, she said yes to marriage. In April of 1958, just a year after Johnny died, Klári became Mrs. Carl Eckert. She was 46.
Johnny, she married for brains, and then when she married Carl Eckert, I think it was for La Jolla.
That's George Dyson. He's the historian of technology from previous episodes who wrote Turing's Cathedral about the birth of the digital universe. His comment about why Klári married Carl is just one explanation, of course, but George does have a personal connection to this story. He grew up in Klári's world. She was even a witness at his father's second wedding.
She moved with him to La Jolla, and she just decided to try and be happy.
La Jolla, California is an affluent seaside enclave at the northern tip of San Diego. Klári seemed truly excited to finally move out west.
But this is really what I want. Sit at the edge of the pool and twiddle my toes. No more drama or excitement. just to be at peace with the world, my husband, and myself.
Yeah, go here, go right here. La Jolla is kind of nestled into a cove, and so the water wraps around La Jolla, if that makes sense. That's me. I'm in a car with our senior editor, Nora Matheson.
Seems like it's right off the road.
We just arrived in La Jolla to check out Klári's home. It's sunny, of course, in the low 70s.
This is it. So yeah, it's walled. You can't see inside the property. Looks cute though.
Nora and I pull up to Klári and Carl's old house. It's classic California style. Single story, mid-century, just a couple of blocks from the ocean. And I can just imagine that Klári was just so taken with this. It must have seemed like paradise. And when she got there, she continued caretaking Johnny's legacy. As for her programming work, there's very little evidence that she continued with it. In 1957, after Johnny died, the Rand Corporation, a Southern California think tank that was keen on computing, offered her a job. We do know that much, but we never found her response or any evidence that she accepted that job. We later found a memo from 1959 where Keith Bruckner, a physicist at UCSD, wrote to Klári about a computing layout for an IBM project that she was apparently working on. But again, we couldn't get our hands on anything else about that. What is clear is that by 1962, 49-year-old Klári was done with computers for good. In a letter she wrote in April of that year, she asked to be removed from a computing seminar's mailing list because
I am not working anymore in the field.
The coding chapter of her life had ended. But around this time, Klári started a new project, a more personal one. She began writing a memoir. She called it Grasshopper in Very Tall Grass. And this brings us all the way back to someone we met at the very beginning of the season, Klári's stepdaughter, Marina von Neumann-Whitman.
And I have here, which I really need to get to the Library of Congress, a few files of her attempts to write an autobiography.
When Carl died in 1973, he left the manuscript to Marina in his will, and she's had the drafts ever since. Marina grew up around Klári, and after reading the memoir, she started seeing her stepmother differently.
I was astounded at how well she wrote in English, which, after all, was her second language, or fifth, or God knows what, anyway. And what a sense of humor she had, which definitely shows up in her manuscripts.
Without the memoir, Klári's life would have looked really different to us, too. In reading it, we get Klári's life as she wanted to tell it, and we meet Klári the narrator, someone witty and blunt and open.
Because she was such a good writer, she just radiated interesting stuff. So just, she maybe needed a little push here and there, but I would love to be her editor.
And Klári wanted an editor, too. Publishing the memoir was a big deal for her. Okay, so I'm looking through these things, and I got to the part of the file where the whole question of publishing the memoir is raised. In one of my long interviews with George Dyson, I told him the story of going through the letters I found at Marina's. A whole stack of them are about Klári's memoir. The lengthy and careful feedback she gets from friends, correspondence with publishers, updates from her agent. At first, everyone seems excited. Her friends are encouraging. Publishers write back to her. But then, in spring of 1963, the Harper and Row people say, we don't want it after all. And then the agent dumps her. And what I then see is that the envelope in which where the agent says, we just aren't seeing any hope for this book, she rips that one open. And you can see she's there's almost violence done to the envelope.
I think if she had signed a contract for her autobiography, it would have completely changed her life.
What does it mean to have spent the past 6 years preserving your famous late husband's story, getting his life down on paper, answering the many calls for translations of his books, posthumous awards, the von Neumann Fellowship in this and that? And then, when you turn to something of your own and finally put your story down on paper, and it's a remarkable story at that, you're told that it's not marketable. We don't know how much this rejection affected Klári, but we do know that we probably wouldn't be telling her story on Lost Women of Science if the book had been published and her work recognized. In any case, Klári would never finish that memoir. Here's George Dyson.
La Jolla was this paradise place, but somehow it in my view, it just this dark cloud of depression came back. So I just think she couldn't just sit in La Jolla and be happy.
On November 9th, 1963, Klári and Carl had friends over. They drank a good amount and stayed up late. According to Carl, the guests left at 1:30 in the morning. Carl eventually went to bed at 3. Klári stayed up.
She had taken her jewelry off and left it at home, and she had drunk a lot of alcohol.
Her car was found by the Wind and Sea beach, a few blocks from her house. It seems Klári drove to the beach, then walked into the surf.
She had sand in her lungs, which means she was breathing when she went in the water.
Klári's body was found washed up on the beach at 6:45 a.m. on November 10th, 1963. A neighbor identified the body. The death was written up in a 6-page report. It says that Klári's dress had been weighed down with 15 pounds of wet sand. Her blood alcohol level was 0.18%. Cause of death, according to the autopsy, asphyxia by drowning. It was ruled a suicide.
You think this is fine if we leave the car here?
Yeah, I think so. It's loud.
It's loud.
Nora and I pull up to the beach where Klári died. It's full of people, surfers, kids with kites, families with babies and dogs. It just kind of makes you very, very, very sad that a person who had so much to give to the world and did give to the world just couldn't live in it. And what a violent way to die. Here's Klári's stepdaughter, Marina von Neumann Whitman again.
I guess I was aware that she was fragile. As I say, there's this gap between her writing that, she was enjoying the common peaceful life and then committed suicide. And, something must have gone on in her head in between. But I don't know.
My father saw her a couple days before and said she was in great spirits. How could she have committed suicide? But people often say that. And that's this tragic end where you read the last page in her journal. She says, I think the exact words are, I do not need to travel anymore because I am there already.
When someone dies by suicide, it's difficult to resist looking for an explanation. We humans want to pin the pieces of a life on a bulletin board, arranging them to show that this led to that and to that. But life isn't as linear or logical as we'd like it to be, and we'll never have all the pieces to explain a life in full. We'll never know the why of Klári's death, and frankly, that's beside the point. What is the point is Klári the person, Klári alive, Klári beyond a single night, a single decision. We had the memoir, which served as our anchor as we navigated Klári's life. But that was all reflection, Klári looking back. I wanted to see her in action. So I turned to the scores of letters she had written and received over the years, and many of those letters were in Hungarian. There was no throwing these things into Google Translate because they were handwritten, and Klári's handwriting was as complicated as the woman herself. We needed just the right translator, one who could decipher that impenetrable Hungarian script.
Hi, Augie.
Hi, Katie. How are you?
How are you? I'm good. How are you?
I'm always fine.
Oh, good.
That's Ági Antal. She's one of the Hungarian translators you've heard throughout this season. Ági and I came up with a system.
So is the sound good?
Yeah, the sound is good. And then if you need a sip of water or tea or anything, just let me know. I would set my alarm for very early Pacific time, and Ági would call me after work in Budapest, and we'd have these sessions, with her reading the English aloud to me. I see it, February the 17th. Oh, her handwriting is really crazy.
My God, don't tell me.
So while I was staring at this incomprehensible scrawl, listening to the English, it felt like something magical was happening. And this person, Klári, through her letters and her diary, she came alive.
So I think I found some really important phrases in her diary that express, even though these phrases were written when she was really young, but they express her attitude to life.
Here's Ági reading from Klári's diary, an entry from January of 1931. Klári was 19.
There must be other meaning of the life beside love, because I have to live, if not for myself, then for the peace of the people around me.
Even when she was young, Klári was introspective, a keen observer of the world.
I don't know what is written in the book of my destiny, but I don't believe that I will ever have a normal life. Do I feel this way just because I'm young?
And she was prescient. She never did have a normal life, and as much as she wanted peace, she was never quite able to accept her life as it was. Coming up, we do what Klári did for Johnny, protect a legacy. I'm Katie Hafner, and this is Lost Women of Science. If you or someone you know may be considering suicide, you can contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255.
It was this perseverance against the darkness of fate or something. She just had such a spirit and obviously intelligence.
That's George Dyson again, reflecting on Klári's life.
And Klári's role, so she was sort of there at the moment of creation. I mean, if you look at this as a sort of cradle in a manger sort of thing, she was holding the cradle.
George is talking about Klári's work writing code. Her Monte Carlo simulations were the first programs executed using the modern code paradigm. She was right there at the birth of our modern digital universe.
So what exactly is Clara von Neumann's contribution? She is part of figuring that out.
That's Nathan Ensminger, a historian of technology at Indiana University, Bloomington.
This separation between what is the machine and what we will come to know to be software. And software is not a word that will be even invented until 1958.
As she was working, Klári was helping to define the terms and shape the landscape. Today, those things have settled into place, and they look very different from how they looked at the start.
I think it is interesting in computing about how the folklore and the mythology comes to shape itself around a particular kind of acceptable narrative. That's usually a kind of white male adolescent, when there were these other possible mythological figures to kind of construct that around.
Today, computing is oriented around the male individual, the disruptor, a new iteration of the great man theory of history we see so often. It's easy to forget it hasn't always been that way.
I argue throughout my work that women are kind of omnipresent in the early history of computing.
And not just the lone woman, women working in teams. Klári was pretty much done with computing work by 1955. For a while, women were still the go-to coders, suited to this quote-unquote menial task. But this quickly started to change. As technology improved, the perception of software and its importance shifted dramatically. The machinery of computers, physically building them, that became the easy part. The hard part now was programming their software. So in the late 1950s and through the 1960s,
just as computers start to become inexpensive and available, it's increasingly hard to make them do good work. And so software just keeps getting more and more difficult and expensive, and there's this kind of language that emerges that there's some kind of crisis happening in software, or as I would say, a kind of labor crisis.
Companies couldn't find enough skilled programmers. The perceived labor crisis became significant enough that in 1968, NATO held a conference to address the problem.
And so they begin saying, well, what happens if we think about software development as a kind of engineering, not as a kind of science, not as a kind of business activity, but as a kind of engineering?
The NATO conference was where the idea of software engineering took off. The thinking was that if you could somehow formalize or codify what programmers did, you could identify and train better programmers, creating a reliable workforce. And while the NATO conference alone didn't drive women out of coding, it was representative of a shift in the industry. Programming was changing from something seen as secretarial work into a respectable career. And in the process, it was rebranded as male.
And by the early 1980s, women have almost disappeared from at least public representations of computing. It's a really remarkable reversal that happens in a relatively short period.
This completely transformed the opportunities for women.
Could Clara von Neumann have become a professional programmer following the 1940s and into the 50s and 60s? Absolutely. Could Clara have become a programmer in the 1980s? I would say almost certainly not.
After the 80s, we get to the part of the story we know pretty well. Bill Gates, the two Steves, Jobs and Wozniak, Mark Zuckerberg, Ivy League dropouts. Great men. The archetype persists, and it's self-perpetuating.
So one of the key things that has become increasingly important in the last 10 years is the fact that people come to university with different levels of prior experience in computer science, and that is not uniformly distributed with respect to race, ethnicity, and gender.
Carla Broadley is a professor of computer science. She's also the executive director of the Center for Inclusive Computing at Northeastern University.
I think that until we make computer science required in high school and taught well in high school, that probably girls in high school aren't going to naturally choose it because of the perception that they have.
A big part of the problem today is access, and this feeling that programming is an insider thing, that it's only for a certain kind of person. Klári's right place at the right time thing, that was rare then and is now. It's not so easy to stumble upon programming.
I think everyone can learn to program, and I think that the majority of people like programming. It's just that the majority of people don't try it.
And Carla, like Klári decades before her, loves programming.
It's using the same part of your brain that you use like when you do art or when you write a story. It's like, how am I going to construct this? It's putting together abstract thoughts, but then it's very concrete because when you write the code, it either works or it doesn't work.
And programming, as we understand it today, as this abstract and concrete challenge where you can create simulated realities. This all started right around the time Klári was coding.
I've heard and read suggests to me that there's a definite and direct legacy of this code.
That's Thomas Haig, the history professor and co-author of the book ENIAC in Action. Klári's most important and lasting contribution to the computing world was her work on Monte Carlo simulations.
The code has evolved beyond recognition, but apparently it does have its recognizable origins and a direct line of descent from what Klári von Neumann was doing.
As George Dyson points out in Turing's Cathedral, today's search engine algorithms draw on the Monte Carlo method that Klári first executed. They don't use a straight-line path from question to answer. Instead, they follow random search paths to find increasingly accurate results. They rely less on the endpoints and more on the intervening paths, and these paths hold meaning. So, once again, Monte Carlo provides us with a framework for looking at Klári's own life. The endpoints of Klári's life are her childhood in Budapest and her death by suicide. Her life was bookended by drama and tragedy, but these bookends aren't where all the meaning resides. They shouldn't cast a shadow on everything else. Her many varied intervening paths, her code, her writing, her relationships. It's through these paths that Klári comes alive. At the end of our interview with Marina von Neumann-Wittmann, we asked her a question central to this series. How should Klára Don von Neumann be remembered?
Well, partly as a woman who sort of created herself. I mean, she turned out to have talents that had never been really discovered. She, as I say, became expert in a lot of things that maybe nobody would have predicted she'd become expert in.
As Klári herself said, she lived many lives with random detours and unlikely pit stops. Along the way, she ventured into a world still unmapped. The digital landscape we live in today. She took hold of what chance handed her and did the unexpected. And that's our story, a grasshopper in very tall grass. I'm Katie Hafner. Thanks for listening. This has been Lost Women of Science. Thanks to everyone who made this initiative happen, including my co-executive producer Amy Scharf, producer Sophie McNulty, associate producer Ashreya Gupta, senior editor Nora Matheson, composer Elizabeth Yunan, and the engineers at Studio D Podcast Production. Thanks also to our voice actors Eva Szabo and Nandor Tari, as well as our many Hungarian translators, Agi Antal, Rick Espenshade, Charles Hebert, Laszlo Marcus, Alina Bessonnier-Williams, and Lehel Molnar. We're grateful to Mike Fung, Kathy Bennett-Warner, Dominique Guilford, Jeff Delvicio, Meredith White, Bob Wachter, Maria Clave, Susan Kerr, Jeannie Stivers, Linda Grace, Rabbi Michael Paley, Marina von Neumann-Wittmann, George Dyson, Thomas Haig, and our interns Hilda Gitchell, Kylie Tanganan, Lisa Kopaeva, and Juliana Russo. Thanks also to the Computer History Museum, to Paula Goodwin, Nicole Searing, and the rest of the legal team at Perkins Coie, and to the Institute for Advanced Study, the Library of Congress, and the UCSD Special Collections for helping us with our search. Many thanks to Barnard College, a leader in empowering young women to pursue their passion in STEM, for support during the Barnard Year of Science. A special shout-out to Celia Bolgatz at the Women's Audio Mission in San Francisco, where this podcast was recorded. Lost Women of Science is funded in part by the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, Schmidt Futures, and the John Templeton Foundation, which catalyzes conversations about living purposeful and meaningful lives. This podcast is distributed by PRX and published in partnership with Scientific American. You can learn more about our initiative at lostwomenofscience.org or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Find us at Lost Women of Psi. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Katie Hafner.
From PRX.